One of the reasons why there were so many radical free thinkers is because of the Great North Road. We were sufficiently far away from York and from London, and indeed travellers travelled from London up to Edinburgh and passed through here. But we were far enough away from the eyes of the king and other people. So the people that lived here were allowed to develop their own free thinking. We talk about a 30-mile radius of lots and lots of different religions that evolved from this area. It really is quite fascinating what happened here in North Nottinghamshire.
When people have told the story of the Mayflower, they've tended to focus very much on the events immediately preceding when Richard Clifton and John Smith led their people to the Netherlands. And that's really missed the point that this is a region that has a very long history of radical Protestant action and thinking that actually stretches from the 1530s to the 1650s. And the separatist movement of the early 1600s is just a small step in that. And there are several key factors, even in the 1530s, that really show the direction things were going to go. So, for example, Thomas Cranmer, the very famous first Protestant Archbishop of Canterbury, he was a Nottinghamshire man. And even after he became Archbishop, he continued to work on and engage with his connections to Nottinghamshire and Lincolnshire. Some of his closest staff, for example, were from Boston. So we have that really interesting character at the very beginning. But the crucial year probably was 1536. In the beginning of the Reformation, the period when Henry was starting to dissolve the monasteries, there was a rebellion in Lincolnshire against his policies. And they turned to the gentry of Nottinghamshire to help in that repression of that rebellion. And we have Sir John Markham, Sir John Hersey and people like that, who were clearly radically committed Protestants at that time. And Markham, in fact, was a close friend of Cranmer from his boyhood. So we can see from the early 1530s, there were Protestants here at a time when most people weren't. And those families then really seeded into the growth of the Protestant faith in this region.
Scrooby Manor, or Scrooby Palace as it was sometimes called, actually belonged to the Archbishop of York. It was one of his occasional residences, and it had belonged to the archbishops since the Domesday Book at least, and only came out of their ownership in the 1960s. It was one of those places where the Archbishop, when he's doing his visitation, going all around his vast see, would maybe come to Scrooby for a week or two a year, that's all, and then move on to his next residence. So to find that there's this underground separatist congregation actually meeting on an archbishop's property, these folk are at loggerheads with the established church. It's quite ironic. I find that quite pleasing. There are an awful lot of radical Puritans who are only, some of them, just a step away from becoming separatists at the end of Elizabeth's reign. And it's as if they're radiating out from the Scrooby area. And they're helped a great deal early on by the very lenient archdeacon for this area, John Louth, who, although you have these radicals being presented to the authorities, they are just getting away with a tap on the hand. So this encourages this movement to grow, not just in Brewster and Jackson and Bradford's generation, but looking at the generation before. Our separatists are standing on the shoulders of others who've already laid the groundwork, which has happened also in East Anglia. You have this previous generation, they're making the inroads, and our folk are building on that.
Christianity started in this region in the early 7th century. So we have a fine window commemorating St. Paulinus, although he probably didn't look very much like the image in this window. He was the first missionary who came to evangelise this region. With King Edwin, many hundreds of local people were baptised in the River Trent, just a few miles from here. A few years later, in about 702 AD, a very important early church conference was held here to resolve the differences between essentially the Roman Church, which was in the south of England, and the Celtic Church, which had moved into the north of England. And one of the windows here commemorates that with pictures of St Wilfrid and St Berthold, who was actually the Archbishop of Canterbury, who were among the many dignitaries who came to Austerfield to resolve the early differences. So one of the complaints that's sometimes made about the Mayflower Pilgrims is that over history they've been called the Pilgrim Fathers, even though there were many women and children on the ship as well. And this window is quite an interesting illustration of that debate, because when it was first put in, it was an entirely male scene. And this led to some complaints, and as a result, you'll be able to see a tiny figure of a woman and a child that's been added in the background.
They had heard that people with similar religious ideas had been able to establish themselves in Amsterdam since the mid-1590s, and the Netherlands in general had a reputation for freedom of religion at this time. Leiden, on the other hand, was a place with which William Brewster had been familiar already as a young man. He'd come here when he was the assistant to William Davison on the diplomatic mission when the Earl of Leicester became Governor-General of the Netherlands in 1586. This is unusual. It shows a Tudor rose and fleur-de-lis, and we know that this is one of about 120 that were made for a special event in 1586. Amsterdam proved difficult to survive in because foreigners were not allowed to have long-term employment. They had to try to survive with day-by-day seeking work. Not an impossibility because of the harbour there. There was loading and unloading of ships. But like other cities, except Leiden, a foreigner had to spend over a year getting established, setting up financial guarantees, and then joining a guild before getting employed. In Leiden, there had been a siege where half the town had died, and to re-establish the town afterwards, they changed the labour laws to attract refugees. People could get long-term employment immediately and not join the guilds as long as they worked for someone who was a guild member. Brewster knew this because he had already met the man who was the responsible person for this change of policy. And that was Jan van Hout, the town secretary. The Pilgrims were the last of several groups of refugees that he had invited to come to Leiden. So that was why they went to Amsterdam, why they came to Leiden.
What's fascinating about Walter Travers is he's not only a pivotal figure in shaping the whole nature of English nonconformity in the Elizabethan Church and connected to all these men on the European continent. He's also being reproduced in his works by William Brewster in the early 17th century. The English congregation in Leiden are reproducing the works of Walter Travers and Thomas Cartwright from their secret press in Leiden.
When Bradford talks about discussion, and there was the idea that gold was easy to get in Guyana, and Bradford said that some of them thought this would be too much temptation. But also when they found out what the people in Guyana looked like, they decided Virginia would be safer. I can show you what they looked like in one of the books we have here. This is a copy of the Cosmographia of Sebastian Münster, and it shows what people thought the natives of Guyana looked like, using a 15th century woodcut that had first been weird people in Central Africa, but was being used everywhere for people out there somewhere who are very strange. But when people like that live in Guyana, maybe moving to Virginia is better. Now that's lunch in Guyana. It's cannibalism. So this is what they saw in various pamphlets as well as a book like this, and chose Virginia instead. Virginia was everything between Canada and Florida, so it's wrong to think that they didn't go to Virginia. They did, but the part we now call Massachusetts was included in what they meant by Virginia.
The wool trade, and specifically the wool and cloth trade, was the biggest trading commodity that the English had. The English were known for their cloth. And that was for partly an obvious reason that sheep outnumbered. There were something like 11 million sheep in England at this time. They outnumbered people by about 4 to 1. And the cloth was highly prized. There's the story of Richard the Lionheart on his route back from the Crusades, and he was captured. And his ransom was paid not in gold or silver, but in wool. And then through the 16th century, through the 1500s, wealthy Europeans who were benefiting from the flood of silver from the South American silver mines were starting to invest in their style and how they looked and so on. And English cloth was highly in demand. And so through the first 50 years of the 1500s, the English, and particularly the London merchants, profited massively.